Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of Ashe County, North Carolina. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this narration. We're interested to know what places and times of day or night these documented accounts reach. The narrow roads winding through the Blue Ridge Mountains of Ashe County, North Carolina, have always held secrets. In 1891, this remote corner of Appalachia became home to a mystery that local authorities would rather forget, a series of events so disturbing that records were allegedly expunged, testimonies lost, and mentions in official documentation reduced to cryptic notations. This is what remains of the Whitlow family's story. In the winter of 1891, when snow blanketed the valleys and isolated the scattered homesteads of Ashe County even further from civilization, the Whitlow farmhouse stood as a dark silhouette against the white landscape. Located approximately 3 miles northeast of Jefferson, the county seat, the two-story timber home, had been built by Elias Whitlow in 1873, shortly after he returned from the Civil War with wounds that never properly healed, both physical and otherwise. County records show that on January 17, 1891, Sheriff Harlan McCoy was called to the Whitlow property after a neighbor, Thomas Greer, reported that no smoke had risen from the chimney for 3 days, despite the bitter cold. What the sheriff discovered that day would be documented in a hastily written report that was filed, and then, according to courthouse clerk Margaret Shelton's testimony in 1962, removed from public records sometime in the spring of 1891. The Whitlow family, Elias, his wife Martha, and Elias's brother Vernon, had vanished. The house stood empty, a half-eaten meal still on the kitchen table, beds unmade, and no signs of packing or planned departure. Only the livestock remained, the cattle and horses nearly dead from neglect in their enclosures. Sheriff McCoy noted in his initial report that the absence appears sudden and unexplained. No blood or signs of struggle visible. What makes this case particularly disturbing is not just the disappearance itself, but what would be uncovered in the months and years that followed, fragments of truth pieced together from diary entries, correspondence, church records, and oral histories passed down through generations of Ashe County residents who speak of the Whitlow case in hushed tones, if they speak of it at all. Before we delve deeper into the darkness that surrounded the Whitlow family, we must understand who they were and the life they led before that fateful January day. According to census records from 1880, Elias Whitlow was 42 years old in 1891, having served in the Confederate Army during the Civil War. His military record indicates he was wounded at the Battle of Spotsylvania Courthouse in 1864 and was discharged shortly thereafter. Martha Whitlow, born Martha Caldwell, was 38 and had married Elias in 1869. Church records at the Jefferson Methodist Church show they had no children, though Martha had suffered several miscarriages according to the sparse medical records kept by Dr. William Foster, the county's only physician at that time. Vernon Whitlow, Elias's younger brother by 7 years, had moved in with the couple in 1888 after losing his own farm near Boone to debt. The 3 adults lived together in apparent harmony, according to statements from neighbors collected by Sheriff McCoy in the weeks following their disappearance. Thomas Greer, whose property bordered the Whitlow farm to the west, described them as quiet folk who kept to themselves but were never unfriendly. Sarah Holcomb, who delivered milk and eggs to the Whitlow household twice weekly, characterized Martha as a thin, serious woman who always paid promptly and spoke little. What set the Whitlows apart from their neighbors, however, was their relative prosperity. Elias had inherited a modest sum from his father and invested in land at a time when prices were depressed following the war. By 1891, the Whitlow farm encompassed nearly 200 acres of mixed forest and cleared pasture land. They grew tobacco and kept livestock, employing seasonal workers during harvest, but otherwise managing the property themselves. The farmhouse, while not lavish, was better constructed than most in the area, with glass windows and a stone foundation, unusual luxuries for rural Ashe County at that time. This relative comfort would become a focal point of speculation in the aftermath of their disappearance. Was their prosperity a motive for foul play, or was there something darker lurking beneath the surface of their seemingly ordinary lives? The first indication that all was not well with the Whitlow family came in November of 1890, approximately 2 months before their disappearance. According to the Journal of Reverend Isaiah Palmer of the Jefferson Methodist Church, Martha Whitlow had approached him after Sunday service, appearing greatly troubled in spirit. The Reverend wrote that Martha spoke of disturbances in the night and expressed concern about her husband's changing disposition. When pressed for details, Martha apparently became reticent and left abruptly. Reverend Palmer's journal, discovered during church renovations in 1943, contains several entries regarding the Whitlows. On November 23, 1890, he wrote, "Mrs. Whitlow attended service alone today. Mr. Whitlow has not been seen at worship for 3 consecutive weeks. When I inquired after his health, Mrs. Whitlow merely stated that he was occupied with matters at home, and quickly changed the subject. There is a peculiar tension about her that I have not observed before." This absence from church was noteworthy because Elias Whitlow had previously been a regular attendee. County voting records and church donation ledgers indicate he was a man who took his civic and religious obligations seriously. His withdrawal from community functions in late 1890 represented a marked departure from established patterns. Sarah Holcomb, the neighbor who delivered dairy products to the Whitlows, later told Sheriff McCoy that during her delivery on January 12, 1891, just days before the disappearance, she had noticed that Martha's hands trembled as she counted out payment. When Sarah inquired if she was feeling unwell, Martha reportedly replied, "There are things happening in this house that I cannot explain." Sarah did not ask for elaboration, later expressing regret at her hesitation. In her testimony to Sheriff McCoy, recorded on February 2, 1891, Sarah elaborated on changes she had observed at the Whitlow household during her biweekly visits. "Starting sometime after harvest season, I noticed the curtains were always drawn, even during daylight hours," she stated. The house had always been kept immaculately clean, but in December and January I observed dust gathering on surfaces and unwashed dishes in the sink. Very unlike Mrs. Whitlow's usual habits. Sarah also reported an incident in late December when she arrived for her regular delivery and found Vernon Whitlow standing alone on the front porch despite the bitter cold. He seemed reluctant to re-enter the house, she recalled. When I asked if something was troubling him, he glanced over his shoulder at the door and said, "My brother is not himself these days." Before I could inquire further, Martha called from inside, and Vernon's entire demeanor changed. He straightened up, as if bracing himself, and went back inside without another word. Perhaps the most telling pre-disappearance account comes from James Porter, a tobacco buyer who visited the farm on January 15, 1891, potentially the last outsider to see the family alive. In a statement given to Sheriff McCoy but subsequently removed from official records, preserved only because Porter himself kept a copy that was discovered among his personal effects after his death in 1931, he described an atmosphere of unbearable tension in the Whitlow home. According to Porter's account, Elias appeared gaunt and distracted, while Vernon paced the floor like a caged animal. Martha served coffee but did not speak a single word during Porter's hour-long visit. Most disturbing was Porter's observation that the brothers would not look at one another, yet seemed unable to occupy separate rooms, as if each feared to let the other out of his sight. Porter noted other unusual details. The house was unnaturally cold, though logs were stacked by the fireplace unused. When I commented on the chill, Elias remarked that heat rises from below, a statement that made little sense given the circumstances. I also observed deep scratches in the wooden floor leading from the kitchen to what I presumed was the cellar door, as if heavy objects had been repeatedly dragged across the boards. Porter concluded his business quickly, purchasing the Whitlow tobacco crop at a price well below market value, a fact he attributed to Elias's apparent eagerness to conclude the transaction. As Porter departed, he claimed that Martha followed him to the edge of the property and pressed a folded piece of paper into his hand, whispering, "If we are gone when you return, look beneath the stones." Porter, unsettled but unsure how to respond, pocketed the paper without reading it and rode away. It was only after news of the disappearance spread that he examined the note, finding it contained only a cryptic sequence of numbers, 7, 19, 3, 8, 14. The significance of these numbers would remain unknown for decades. Porter's account gains additional credibility from an entry in his personal ledger book, where he typically recorded business transactions. On the date of his visit to the Whitlow farm, instead of his usual methodical notation of tobacco quality, weight, and price, he had written only, "Whitlow Farm, transaction completed, will not return there." This was followed by a rough sketch of what appeared to be the Whitlow house with an unusual addition, dark lines radiating outward from the foundation, resembling roots or tentacles. This sketch was later dismissed by investigators as an idle doodle, but its deviation from Porter's otherwise business-like record-keeping is notable. In the immediate aftermath of the discovery of the Whitlow's absence, Sheriff McCoy organized a search party consisting of local men and a few bloodhounds borrowed from a sheriff in neighboring Wilkes County. The initial search focused on the possibility that the family had met with foul play in the surrounding forest, or perhaps fallen through ice on the New River, which ran along the eastern boundary of their property. No bodies were found, nor any evidence of violence. The dogs tracked scents to the edge of the main road leading toward West Jefferson, suggesting the family or someone had departed in that direction. Curiously, no horses were missing from the property, and the Whitlow's wagon remained in its shed. If they had left voluntarily, they had done so on foot in the middle of winter, a puzzling and potentially fatal decision. An entry in Sheriff McCoy's personal journal, separate from his official reports and discovered among his possessions after his death in 1916, reveals his growing unease with the case. January 19, 1891, the Whitlow matter continues to disturb me. Today, while examining the cellar of the property, 3 of my men refused to descend the stairs, claiming the air below felt wrong in their lungs. I myself experienced a momentary sensation of vertigo upon reaching the bottom step. The cellar appears recently excavated, with a pit dug into the earthen floor approximately 7 feet deep. The purpose of such excavation remains unclear. Found unusual markings carved into the stone foundation walls, not letters of any alphabet I recognize, but clearly deliberate. Will return tomorrow with better light to document these markings. No record of this promised return visit exists in either the official case file or McCoy's personal writings. When questioned about this decades later, his widow recalled that her husband had returned home late on January 19th, appearing shaken and refused to discuss the case further that evening. The next day, he assigned Deputy Tucker to take over the investigation of the cellar while he focused on tracking potential sightings of the family in neighboring communities. Sheriff McCoy's investigation shifted to the possibility of robbery as a motive, but this theory quickly lost credibility when a locked chest in the Whitlow's bedroom was found to contain over $300 in gold and silver coins, a substantial sum in 1891. Martha's modest jewelry, including a gold locket containing a braid of dark hair, remained in her dresser drawer. Nothing of obvious value appeared to have been taken. A thorough inventory of the house, conducted on January 25, 1891, revealed other peculiarities. Though it was the dead of winter, the Whitlow's heavy coats still hung on pegs by the door. Their boots remained in their customary place in the mudroom. No clothing appeared to be missing from their wardrobes. If they had fled, they had done so without the basic necessities for winter survival. Most puzzling was the state of the kitchen on the day of the initial discovery. A meal had been partially consumed, stew, by all appearances, with 3 bowls on the table. One was nearly empty, one half full and one apparently untouched. A loaf of bread had been sliced but not completely served. The stove still contained warm embers when Sheriff McCoy arrived, suggesting the family had disappeared only hours before Thomas Greer noticed the lack of chimney smoke. As January turned to February with no sign of the missing family, interest in the case began to wane. The farm was placed in the temporary custody of Elias's cousin, Frederick Whitlow, who lived in Jefferson. Frederick arranged for the care of the livestock, but did not move into the house, telling neighbors he found the place unwelcoming and preferred to ride out daily to tend to necessary chores. Frederick's reluctance to occupy the house became a subject of local gossip. In a letter to his sister, living in Richmond, discovered in a collection of family correspondence donated to the Ashe County Historical Society in 1978, Frederick wrote, "I cannot bring myself to sleep beneath that roof. Something about the air inside makes my thoughts turn strange. Twice now I have caught myself standing at the cellar door, my hand on the latch, with no memory of having approached it. The livestock are uneasy as well, the horses startle at nothing, and the milk cows have gone dry, despite having calved only last month. I complete my necessary duties and depart before sunset each day, and even then I feel as if something watches me from the windows as I ride away." It was Frederick who made the first truly disturbing discovery related to the case. While cleaning out the root cellar in late February 1891, he found a series of marks scratched into the stone wall. Initially assuming them to be tallies kept by Martha to track preserved foods, he was struck by their unusual pattern, groups of 5 vertical lines crossed by a horizontal line, creating a pattern similar to musical notation. Frederick counted 67 such marks. Their purpose remained unclear, but their deliberate nature suggested intent rather than idle scratching. In his report to Sheriff McCoy, Frederick noted that the marks appeared to have been made with different implements over time, some shallow and precise, as if carved with a knife or needle, others deeper and more ragged, potentially gouged with a nail or other improvised tool. Most disturbingly, the most recent-looking marks appeared to have traces of what might have been dried blood in the grooves, though Frederick acknowledged this might have been rust or soil. More unsettling was Frederick's discovery in early March of what appeared to be a concealed door in the pantry, leading to a narrow space between the kitchen wall and the exterior of the house. Inside this space, barely wide enough for a person to stand, hung 3 sets of clothing, 1 male outfit of large size, 1 of medium size, and 1 female dress. Each garment had been slashed repeatedly with what must have been a sharp blade, reducing them to ribbons while still on their hooks. Frederick, deeply disturbed, reported this to Sheriff McCoy, who documented the finding but offered no explanation. The concealed space contained one other item, a small wooden box approximately 6 inches square, nailed to the back wall at eye level. Inside was a single human tooth, a molar, apparently extracted rather than naturally shed, with dried tissue still attached to the root. Whose tooth it was and why it had been preserved in this hidden location remained unexplained. Sheriff McCoy confiscated this item as potential evidence, but it was not mentioned in any subsequent official reports, and its whereabouts after 1891 are unknown. As winter gave way to spring with no resolution to the mystery, the case of the Whitlows might have faded from memory entirely were it not for the arrival of Martha's sister, Catherine Caldwell, from Richmond, Virginia, in April 1891. Catherine, having received no response to several letters sent to Martha, had finally made the journey to Ashe County to investigate personally. Catherine's presence reinvigorated the investigation, as she refused to accept the prevailing theory that the family had simply chosen to abandon their property and move elsewhere. Martha would never leave without word, she insisted to Sheriff McCoy, according to his notes, and certainly not without her mother's Bible, which I find still on her bedside table. Catherine took up residence in the Whitlow home, despite Frederick's warnings about its unsettling atmosphere. She was determined to discover what had happened to her sister and brothers-in-law. What she found or what found her during her stay would add another layer to the growing mystery. Catherine's first discovery came on her second day in the house. While sorting through Martha's personal effects, she found a small diary hidden beneath the mattress of the marriage bed. Most entries were mundane, detailing household accounts, weather observations, and brief notes about visitors. Beginning in October 1890, however, the entries took on a more troubled tone. Martha wrote of hearing movement in the walls at night, and of Elias's increasing preoccupation with the cellar. An entry dated November 12, 1890 read, E. spends all daylight hours below now. When he emerges for supper, his clothes are caked with soil, and he speaks little. V has expressed concern about E's obsession with whatever he believes he has found beneath the house. When questioned directly, E only says, "It goes deeper than we knew. I fear for his mind." By December, Martha's entries became increasingly fragmented and distressed. She wrote of hearing Elias conversing with someone in the cellar when she knew Vernon was in town. She described waking to find her husband standing at the window in the dead of night, whispering to the darkness outside. Most disturbing was her observation that the soil E brings up from below has a foul odor, like meat left too long in summer heat. Yet he keeps a jar of it beside our bed, and sometimes I wake to find him touching it to his lips. The final entry, dated January 14, 1891, the day before James Porter's visit and 3 days before the family was reported missing, contained only a single line, "God help us, for what E has called up from the dark below cannot be uncalled." After residing in the house for just over a week, Catherine appeared at the sheriff's office in Jefferson, visibly shaken. She reported hearing conversations from empty rooms and claimed that each morning she found furniture slightly rearranged from where she had left it the night before. Most specifically, she described finding 3 chairs positioned in a triangle in the center of the kitchen each morning, regardless of where she had placed them the previous evening. Sheriff McCoy, likely doubting Catherine's mental stability, nonetheless documented her claims. Tucker's official report indicated no unusual occurrences, though he admitted to sleeping poorly due to the natural creaking of an aging house and the persistent wind through the valley. What Tucker did not include in his official report, but later confided to his wife, as revealed in her diary found after her death in 1940, was that on the second night he distinctly heard what sounded like someone pacing methodically in the attic space, though upon investigation with his lantern, he found the attic empty and undisturbed. He agreed to assign Deputy Samuel Tucker to stay at the property for 3 nights to investigate. Tucker's wife wrote that her husband refused to speak further of his experience at the Whitlow house and would change the subject whenever it arose. She recorded one exception, however, which occurred in 1893 when Tucker woke screaming from a nightmare. When she managed to calm him, he allegedly said, "I saw what was in the Whitlow cellar. God help me. I saw it crawling up the wall in the dark, and it wore Elias's face on something that was not a head." The next morning, Tucker claimed to have no memory of this outburst, and his wife, respecting his evident distress, never mentioned it again. Catherine Caldwell remained at the property until early May, when she abruptly packed her belongings and returned to Richmond. Before departing, she visited Reverend Palmer at the Methodist Church and entrusted him with a sealed envelope, instructing him not to open it unless proof of my sister's fate is discovered. The envelope remained sealed in the church records for decades. Catherine never returned to Ashe County. According to reports from Richmond newspapers, she became increasingly reclusive after her return, eventually selling her home in 1894 and relocating to Boston, where she lived until her death in 1938. She never married and, according to her obituary, devoted her life to the study of ancient languages and obscure theological texts, eventually becoming a respected, if somewhat eccentric, translator of Aramaic manuscripts for Harvard University. One of Catherine's academic papers, published in a limited circulation journal in 1912, bore the curious title, on certain phrases better left unspoken, linguistic taboos in pre-Christian Appalachian settlements. The paper argued that early settlers in the mountain regions of what would become western North Carolina and eastern Tennessee had encountered and subsequently adopted linguistic prohibitions from an unspecified, earlier culture, forbidding the utterance of certain words or phrases that were believed to thin the barriers between perceived realities. This paper received little attention outside specialist circles, but is noteworthy given Catherine's experiences at the Whitlow farm. As summer approached, interest in the Whitlow case diminished further. Sheriff McCoy's attention turned to other matters, and the community gradually stopped speculating about the family's fate. Frederick Whitlow continued to maintain the property half-heartedly, eventually leasing the farmland to neighboring farmers while leaving the house vacant. It might have remained nothing more than a local mystery, one of many disappearances in the isolated mountains of western North Carolina, had it not been for a severe storm in August 1891 that caused significant damage throughout Ashe County. Among the casualties was a massive oak tree on the Whitlow property, estimated to be over 100 years old, which was struck by lightning and split down the middle. Frederick, assessing the damage after the storm, made a gruesome discovery. As the tree had toppled, its massive root system had torn free from the earth, exposing a shallow grave that the roots had partially grown through. In the grave lay the remains of a man, badly decomposed but identifiable by his clothing and a distinctive belt buckle, as Vernon Whitlow, Elias's younger brother. The discovery of Vernon's body transformed the disappearance into a probable murder investigation. Sheriff McCoy, with assistance from authorities in neighboring counties, conducted a thorough search of the entire property, including dragging the nearby section of the New River. No further remains were discovered. An examination of Vernon's body by Dr. Foster revealed that he had died from a severe blow to the back of the skull, delivered with significant force by a blunt object. The estimated time of death aligned with the January disappearance. Most puzzling was the position in which Vernon had been buried, face down, with his hands apparently tied behind his back with a cord that had largely decomposed. Dr. Foster's report, dated August 24, 1891, contained several observations that were excluded from the official inquest findings. He noted that the decomposition of the body was irregular and inconsistent with typical post-mortem processes. Specifically, while most of the soft tissues had decayed as expected for a body buried for 7 months, the brain tissue, normally among the first to decompose, was unusually preserved with distinct structures still identifiable. Foster wrote that the brain displayed peculiar discoloration with black veining throughout the tissue that does not correspond to normal. Vascular structures. Most disturbing was Foster's observation that despite the overall state of decomposition, Vernon's eyes remained relatively intact, though desiccated, and fixed in an expression that suggests extreme terror at the time of death. Foster concluded his report with a statement, "In my 32 years of medical practice, I have never observed such anomalies in human remains. I cannot account for these findings through any natural process known to medical science." This report was filed with Sheriff McCoy, but was not made public at the time. It resurfaced only in 1957 when Dr. Foster's granddaughter discovered it among his personal papers and donated it to the County Historical Society. Suspicion immediately fell on Elias Whitlow. The working theory, as outlined in Sheriff McCoy's notes, was that Elias had murdered his brother, perhaps over a financial dispute or some personal grievance, and then fled with Martha. But this theory had obvious flaws. Why would Martha accompany her husband after such an act? Why leave behind their savings? And where had they gone in the dead of winter, on foot? The discovery of Vernon's body led to the unsealing of Catherine Caldwell's envelope at the Methodist Church. Inside was a letter from Catherine, along with several pages apparently torn from Martha's personal diary. Catherine's letter expressed her belief that A malevolence has taken hold within the walls of my sister's home, and that she feared Elias is no longer himself, but something hollow, wearing his likeness. Catherine described her own experiences in the house, writing that, on her final night there, she had awakened to find herself standing in the cellar, without any memory of having left her bed. By the light of a candle she found already burning on a stone ledge, she observed that the excavation Elias had begun now extended well beyond what Frederick had reported. A narrow tunnel, barely wide enough for a man to crawl through, had been dug horizontally into the earth beyond the foundation wall. I found myself drawn toward this opening, Catherine wrote, feeling a strange compulsion to enter it despite the obvious danger of collapse. As I knelt before the tunnel entrance, I became aware of a sound emanating from within, a low rhythmic pulsing, like the beating of a heart within the earth itself. Then came a whisper, so faint I might have imagined it, but the words were clear. "Catherine, come down to us." The voice was Elias's, yet somehow not his alone. As if multiple throats formed the words in unison, Catherine claimed she fled the cellar and immediately packed her belongings, leaving the property before dawn. She concluded her letter with a warning. "Whatever dwells beneath the Whitlow house has not departed with my sister and her husband. It remains waiting. I implore you, Reverend Palmer, to advise the authorities to fill in that cellar completely and to prevent anyone from residing in that house hereafter." The diary pages, dating from November 1890 to early January 1891, documented Martha's growing concern about her husband's behavior. She wrote of Elias spending long hours in the cellar, engaged in what she called whispered conferences with himself. She noted his increasing paranoia, particularly regarding Vernon, whom Elias had begun to accuse of theft of thoughts and nocturnal intrusions. Martha described an incident in late December when she entered the kitchen to find Elias standing where Vernon, who sat at the table with his morning coffee. Elias held a carving knife above his brother, who appeared frozen in place, unaware of the threat behind him. When Martha gasped, Elias lowered the knife and turned to her with an expression of confusion, asking why she looked frightened. When she described what she had seen, Elias denied having picked up the knife at all and suggested she was seeing things that weren't there. Vernon, upon being told of the incident, became visibly disturbed but advised Martha not to confront Elias directly, saying only, "There are times when he isn't entirely present." Most disturbing was Martha's entry from January 10th, just days before the disappearance. "E. no longer sleeps. Third night, I have found him standing over our bed watching. When questioned, he claims no memory of rising. V. says we must leave, that something is happening to E's mind. We plan to depart for Richmond after the tobacco buyer's visit. God help us if E discovers our intent." This entry suggested that Martha and Vernon had planned to flee from Elias, fearing for their safety, a plan that Vernon, at least, did not survive to execute. The investigation regained momentum through the fall of 1891, focusing on locating Elias and Martha. Telegraph inquiries were sent to neighboring counties and states. Elias's description, a tall man with a pronounced limp from his war wound and a distinctive facial scar, was circulated to law enforcement offices throughout the region. No confirmed sightings were reported. However, unsubstantiated reports began to emerge from communities to the west. A storekeeper in Johnson City, Tennessee, approximately 60 miles from Ashe County, reported serving a man matching Elias's description in late February 1891. The man had purchased supplies including rope, a hunting knife, and preserved foods, paying with silver coins. When asked his name, the man allegedly hesitated before responding Smith. The storekeeper noted that the customer spoke in an unusually flat tone and stared without blinking for uncomfortably long periods. A similar report came from Knoxville in April, where a boarding house keeper recalled a lodger who stayed for 3 nights before departing without notice, leaving behind bloodied bedsheets. The man had given his name as Whitlow and walked with a limp but otherwise, the description did not match Elias precisely. The boarding house keeper described the man as gaunt to the point of emaciation, with eyes so deeply sunken they appeared as dark hollows. These reports, while intriguing, could not be verified. They appeared in Sheriff McCoy's notes, but were treated as unreliable hearsay rather than actionable intelligence. The sheriff likely recognized that such vague sightings are common in high-profile cases, with witnesses often misremembering details or confusing unrelated individuals with the subjects of an investigation. As 1891 drew to a close, the case remained officially open but effectively cold. Sheriff McCoy, in his annual report to the county commissioners, listed the Whitlow case as unresolved, with one confirmed death and 2 individuals missing under suspicious circumstances. He recommended that the Whitlow property be sold at auction after a legally required waiting period, with proceeds held in trust should Martha or her heirs ever return to claim them. The auction took place in June of 1892. The property sold for considerably less than its value, as rumors of tragedy, and worse, whispers of something unnatural about the house itself, had diminished interest among potential buyers. The purchaser was James Harden, a cattle farmer from Tennessee, who was either unaware of or unconcerned by the property's history. Harden's tenure at the former Whitlow farm was brief and ended tragically. In November 1892, less than 6 months after taking possession, Harden was found hanging from a rafter in the barn. The coroner ruled the death a suicide, noting that Harden had left no note, but had been observed by neighbors becoming increasingly withdrawn and agitated in the weeks before his death. The property was sold again, this time to a logging company that had no interest in the house itself, only the timber on the land. What the official record does not include is the statement of Harden's hired hand, William Cobb, who discovered the body. Cobb initially told neighbors that when he found Harden, the man's eyes were open, and his expression was not one of suffering, but of relief. More troubling was Cobb's claim that Harden had spent the 3 nights prior to his death digging in the cellar of the house, refusing to explain why. On the morning of Harden's death, Cobb claimed to have seen freshly turned earth around the opening of what appeared to be a tunnel extending beyond the cellar wall, presumably the same tunnel Catherine Caldwell had described months earlier. Cobb's account was dismissed by authorities as the embellishment of a superstitious man, especially when subsequent investigation showed no evidence of any tunnel in the cellar. Whether Harden had uncovered and then resealed such a passage, or whether Cobb had invented the detail entirely, remains unclear. The house remained vacant, gradually falling into disrepair. Local children began to dare one another to spend a night within its walls, though few actually attempted the feat. Those who did reported nothing more specific than an overwhelming sense of dread and the feeling of being watched. By 1900, the roof had partially collapsed, and nature began to reclaim the structure. One local legend that emerged during this period concerned a group of 3 teenage boys who allegedly entered the ruins on a summer night in 1898, intending to prove their courage to their peers. According to the story, only 2 returned, claiming the third had fallen through rotted floorboards into the cellar. When adults arrived with lanterns to search for the missing youth, they found no trace of him, despite the cellar being shallow and easily examined. The missing boy was never found, and the incident was officially attributed to the teenagers fabricating a disappearance as a prank. However, the 2 remaining boys reportedly maintained their account into adulthood, refusing to approach the property again. The Whitlow case might have been forgotten entirely, relegated to local folklore, had it not been for a discovery made in 1924, more than 3 decades after the disappearance. A surveyor mapping properties for tax purposes in Ashe County found human remains in a remote cave approximately 12 miles from the former Whitlow property. The remains were determined to be those of a woman who had died approximately 35 years earlier. Among the effects found with the remains was a gold locket containing a braid of dark hair identical to the one described in Martha Whitlow's possessions. The coroner determined that the woman had died from exposure, having apparently sought shelter in the cave during winter. No signs of violence were noted on the skeletal remains. The surveyor, Robert Jenkins, provided additional details that were not included in the official report. He stated that the cave entrance was partially concealed by vegetation and would have been difficult to locate without specific knowledge of its existence. Inside, the remains were found not near the entrance, as would be expected of someone seeking temporary shelter, but in the deepest accessible part of the cave, approximately 40 feet from the opening. This positioning suggested either that the woman had been attempting to hide rather than simply escape the elements, or that she had been placed there after death. Jenkins also reported finding a series of markings scratched into the cave wall near the remains, vertical lines grouped in fives and crossed by horizontal lines, identical to the pattern Frederick Whitlow had discovered in the cellar years earlier. Jenkins counted 73 such marks, 6 more than Frederick had documented in 1891. The implication was disturbing. If these marks had indeed been made by Martha Whitlow, she had continued the practice from the cellar in her final refuge, adding 6 more tallies before her death. This discovery led to speculation that Martha had indeed fled from Elias, perhaps after witnessing Vernon's murder, but had become lost in the unfamiliar forest during the harsh January weather. She had apparently carried little with her besides the locket, suggesting a hasty departure. The remains were identified as Martha Whitlow based on the locket and the approximate time of death, though no absolute confirmation was possible. The discovery of Martha's probable remains still left Elias Whitlow unaccounted for. Had he pursued Martha into the forest after killing Vernon? Had he met his own fate elsewhere? Or had he successfully escaped, perhaps creating a new identity in some distant location? A partial answer came in 1931, when James Porter, the tobacco buyer who had been among the last to see the Whitlows alive, died in Winston-Salem. Among his personal papers was found the note Martha had pressed into his hand, containing the sequence of numbers 7193814, along with Porter's written account of his final visit to the Whitlow farm. Porter's account contained details he had apparently withheld from Sheriff McCoy. He wrote that during his visit, he had observed Elias Whitlow repeatedly rubbing soil, presumably from the cellar excavation, between his fingers, bringing them to his nose to smell, and once, when he thought Porter wasn't looking, to his tongue. Porter also noted that when Elias spoke, his voice occasionally shifted in both pitch and cadence mid-sentence, as if 2 different people were taking turns using his mouth. Most disturbing was Porter's claim that at one point Vernon Whitlow had pulled him aside and whispered urgently, "If you value your soul, do not go into the cellar, no matter what my brother says. There is something down there that should never have been found." Porter's son, intrigued by the cryptic numbers and the story behind them, traveled to Ashe County to investigate. After consulting with elderly residents who remembered the Whitlow case, he was directed to the remains of the farmhouse, by then little more than a stone foundation and rotting timbers. Counting paces from what had been the front door, using the numbers as coordinates, 7 paces north, 19 east, 3 south, 8 west, 14 north, he located a flat stone beneath which was buried a tin box. The location was significant. It placed the box well away from the house itself, in what would have been an unremarkable section of the yard. The deliberate burial and the precise directions suggested Martha had hidden something she considered important enough to preserve, but too dangerous to keep within the house. The fact that she entrusted the location to Porter, a comparative stranger, rather than to Vernon, implies she may have feared her brother-in-law would not survive to retrieve it, a fear that proved tragically prophetic. Inside the box was a leather-bound journal, its pages warped by moisture, but largely legible. The journal belonged not to Martha, as might have been expected, but to Vernon Whitlow. The entries began shortly after his arrival at the farm in 1888 and continued until January 14, 1891, the day before the family was last seen by James Porter. Vernon's journal painted a disturbing picture of life at the Whitlow farm. The early entries described tension between the brothers, with Elias resentful of having to shelter his financially ruined sibling. By 1889, however, Vernon wrote of a marked change in Elias's demeanor, a new obsession with the property's cellar, where Elias spent increasing amounts of time alone. Vernon described how in the spring of 1890, Elias had begun digging in the cellar floor, claiming he needed to go deeper to find something he could not or would not name. Martha had apparently been distressed by this behavior, but unable to dissuade her husband from his obsession. On May 23, 1890, Vernon wrote, "E. called me down to the cellar today to show me his progress. The pit is now nearly 6 feet deep, and he has uncovered what appears to be stonework of some kind, a foundation wall or perhaps a well, though of unusual construction. The stones are fitted together without mortar, their faces incised with markings I took to be mason's marks, though E. insists they are words of a sort. When I suggested contacting the Historical Society in Raleigh about the find, E. became agitated, saying no one else must know until he has understood what lies beneath. His possessiveness about a mere archaeological curiosity seems excessive." By June, Vernon was recording his growing concern about Elias's mental state. "E. has taken to sleeping in the cellar," he wrote on June 17th. When Martha pleaded with him to return to their bed, he told her, "It speaks more clearly in the dark, and I must listen." When she asked what speaks, he would not answer directly, saying only the deeper voice. "I fear my brother's mind has been affected by his war experiences, perhaps exacerbated by the isolation of farm life. I have suggested a visit to Dr. Foster, but E. refuses all medical attention." By November 1890, Vernon wrote of hearing Elias engaged in what sounded like conversations in the cellar, though no other person was present. He speaks in his voice and then responds in another, Vernon recorded, deeper and somehow hollow, as if echoing from inside a well. On December 8th, Vernon described a particularly disturbing incident. Found E. in the kitchen before dawn, standing motionless by the stove. When I spoke his name, he did not respond for several seconds, then turned slowly. His eyes seemed somehow wrong, not in appearance, but in the way they moved, as if someone unaccustomed to having eyes was learning to use them. He asked me what day it was, and when I told him, he appeared confused, saying, "Then I have lost time again." Before I could question him further, he returned to normal awareness, claiming to have no memory of our exchange. I am increasingly convinced that E. suffers from some form of mental splintering, perhaps what the alienists call double consciousness. The most chilling entries came in the final weeks. Vernon described how Elias had begun sleepwalking, sometimes standing motionless for hours in dark corners of the house. Martha had found him one night standing over their bed, staring down at her with open eyes that did not seem to register her presence. When she spoke his name, he had not responded. On January 3, 1891, Vernon wrote, "I ventured into the cellar while E. was in town. The pit is now much deeper than when I last saw it, and the tunnel has been extended into the earth beyond the foundation wall. Most disturbing was what I found hanging from nails driven into the stone foundation, dozens of small pouches made from scraps of cloth, each containing soil, dead insects, and what appeared to be small bones. Bird or rodent, I pray. In one corner, partially covered by a burlap sack, I discovered a wooden box containing a book, bound in what looked like dark leather, the cover unmarked. I opened it to find pages of text in no language I recognize, the characters similar to those carved on the stones E. has uncovered. Some pages contain diagrams of human anatomy, but with disturbing differences from normal physiology, additional organs, passageways that do not exist in the human body. I replaced everything as I found it and departed, but fear E. will somehow know I have been there." Vernon's final entry, dated January 14, 1891, read, "It is no longer Elias who walks these halls, though it wears his face. M has agreed we must leave tomorrow after the tobacco buyer departs. We will go to her sister in Richmond until we can determine what affliction has taken hold of E. I fear leaving him in this state, but fear more remaining another night under this roof. There is something in the cellar that should never have been disturbed. M has given the location of this journal to the tobacco buyer, Porter, with instructions to retrieve it if we do not return. If you are reading this, stranger, know that whatever dwells beneath the Whitlow farm must remain buried. Build the pit, collapse the tunnel, and let what sleeps below return to its slumber. The journal ended there, with no indication of the events that would lead to Vernon's murder and burial beneath the oak tree, presumably later that same day or the next. The discovery of Vernon's journal reignited interest in the case, particularly regarding what Elias might have uncovered in the cellar. In 1932, a small archaeological team from the University of North Carolina received permission to excavate the cellar of the ruined Whitlow house. Their findings were documented in a brief academic paper that was never widely circulated and was subsequently difficult to locate in university archives. According to the paper, the team discovered that Elias had indeed excavated a large portion of the cellar floor, creating a pit approximately 7 feet deep. At the bottom of this pit, they found what appeared to be the partial foundation of a much older structure, possibly dating to the early 18th century, before American independence. Among the stones of this older foundation, they discovered a small metal container similar to a snuff box but made of an unusual alloy that they could not precisely identify. Dr. Lawrence Abernethy, the archaeologist who led the excavation, provided more detailed observations in his personal field notes than appeared in the published paper. He described the stonework of the older foundation as unlike any colonial construction I have encountered in 30 years of field work in the Appalachian region. The stones, he noted, were cut with remarkable precision and fitted together so tightly that a blade could not be inserted between them despite the passage of centuries. Most curious was the complete absence of mortar or any other binding agent, yet the structure remained perfectly aligned. Abernethy also noted that the arrangement of the stones did not conform to any architectural purpose he could discern. Rather than forming a rectilinear foundation as would be expected, they created a circular pattern with what appeared to be deliberate gaps at irregular intervals. The overall impression, he wrote, is less of a building foundation than of a form of written communication rendered in stone, as if the structure itself were meant to be read rather than inhabited. The box contained a folded piece of parchment covered in writing, in an unknown language or cipher. The team was unable to translate the text despite consulting with linguistics experts. The paper noted that the excavation was halted prematurely when several team members reported experiencing acute anxiety and auditory disturbances while working in the cellar. The artifacts were supposedly transported to the university for further study, but their current whereabouts are unknown. What the published paper omitted, but Abernethy recorded in his field journal, was that 3 members of the excavation team subsequently suffered from what he termed nervous collapse in the weeks following their work at the Whitlow site. One graduate student was briefly institutionalized after being found wandering the university campus at night, muttering about voices from the stones. Another team member resigned his position and reportedly moved to Arizona, cutting all contact with former colleagues. Abernethy himself complained of recurring nightmares featuring geometrically impossible architecture, and woke his wife screaming on several occasions. He took a sabbatical in early 1933 and upon his return refused to discuss the Whitlow excavation or allow his students to access the materials recovered from the site. The final documented development in the Whitlow case came in 1962 when courthouse clerk Margaret Shelton, in the process of organizing old records, discovered Sheriff McCoy's original case file hidden behind a loose panel in the records room. The file contained documentation that had been removed from public access in 1891, including James Porter's statement and detailed notes from the investigation. Most significantly, the file contained a sealed envelope labeled Final Statement, Elias Whitlow. with a notation indicating it had been received by the sheriff's office in October 1891 but never opened. Shelton, together with then-Sheriff Robert McIntyre, opened the envelope in the presence of a county judge. The letter was postmarked from New Orleans, Louisiana, and began with the declaration, "By the time this reaches you, I will have taken my own life, as it is the only way to ensure that what now resides within me dies as well." The letter contained Elias's confession to the murder of his brother Vernon, whom he claimed had conspired with Martha to steal what I had found. He wrote of discovering the ancient foundation while digging a new root cellar in 1889, and of unearthing the metal box with its mysterious parchment. Inside was a 12-page letter written in what handwriting experts later confirmed was Elias Whitlow's distinctive script. Elias described becoming obsessed with deciphering the text, spending countless hours in the cellar. According to Elias's account, he eventually succeeded in pronouncing the words inscribed on the parchment, though he did not record them in his confession. He wrote only that, upon speaking them aloud, he experienced a division within myself, as if my own shadow had been granted independent thought, and began to whisper suggestions that no God-fearing man should entertain. Elias claimed that this other gradually gained strength within him, sometimes taking control of his body while his consciousness observed helplessly. He described watching himself standing over Martha as she slept, his hands hovering inches from her throat, unable to control his own movements. He wrote of hearing his own voice speaking words he did not intend, engaged in conversations he could not later recall. There were periods of days, Elias wrote, when I would find myself in rooms of the house with no memory of having entered them. I would discover dirt beneath my fingernails, and not know how it came to be there. Martha would speak of conversations we had had that I could not remember. The gaps in my awareness grew longer until I began to feel like a guest in my own body, permitted only occasional residence. Elias described his growing awareness that whatever had taken partial possession of him was connected to the ancient structure beneath his cellar, that in some sense he had not discovered it, but had been led to uncover it. I now believe, he wrote, that it waited for someone to speak those words again after centuries of silence. It needed a voice, and I provided one. It needed hands, and I offered mine, though unknowingly. The confession became increasingly disjointed in its latter pages, with Elias alternating between expressions of remorse and disturbing declarations that the depths of the earth hold secrets that mankind has wisely forgotten. He admitted to killing Vernon with an axe handle when his brother and Martha attempted to leave the farm, striking him from behind as Vernon loaded a small bag into their wagon. Martha had fled into the forest upon witnessing the murder. Elias claimed he pursued her for miles through the snow, but lost her trail as darkness fell. He returned to the farm, buried Vernon's body beneath the oak tree, and then burned the parchment and box in the kitchen stove, hoping to end what I had begun. Finding this insufficient, he abandoned the property and fled west, eventually reaching New Orleans. Most disturbing was Elias's claim that despite destroying the parchment, he continued to experience periods of lost time and the sense of another presence within his mind. It slumbers now, he wrote, but grows stronger when darkness falls. I cannot risk allowing it to gain full control. The waters of the Mississippi will claim us both by dawn. The letter's final paragraphs contained a warning and a plea. To whoever reads these words, the thing beneath my farm is older than our understanding. It sleeps in cycles I cannot comprehend. What I woke was merely a fragment, a tendril of something vast. It reaches through stone, through soil, through minds. It does not think as we think. It does not want as we want. But it hungers in its fashion. Elias concluded, seal the cellar, destroy the foundation stones with their markings. Let no one speak aloud any words found carved there, and if you should hear a voice in the night that sounds like mine, calling your name from below ground, I beg you, do not answer. Sheriff McIntyre, after reading the confession, ordered a telegraph inquiry to New Orleans authorities regarding any reports of a body matching Elias's description found in the river. Records indicated that the remains of a man fitting Elias's description, including the distinctive facial scar and evidence of an old leg injury, had indeed been recovered from the Mississippi River in November 1891, approximately 1 month after the letter was posted. The body had never been identified and was buried in a pauper's grave. An addendum to the New Orleans police report, not included in the telegraph summary but discovered years later by a researcher examining the case, noted that the deceased's right hand had been tightly clenched around an object that had to be pried from the fingers after death. The object was described as a small stone, possibly quartz, inscribed with markings of unknown origin. The stone was logged as personal effects, but subsequently disappeared from police storage. With Elias's confession and apparent suicide, Vernon's murder solved, and Martha's remains likely identified, the official investigation into the Whitlow case was formally closed in 1962. The file was sealed and placed in the county archives, where it remained largely forgotten for decades. The former Whitlow property changed hands multiple times throughout the 20th century. The house itself was never rebuilt, and eventually a new structure was erected some distance from the original foundation. Local residents continued to consider the area surrounding the old cellar hole as a place best avoided, particularly after dark. In 1968, a graduate student in folklore from Duke University visited Ashe County to collect local legends and oral histories. Among the stories he recorded was that of an elderly resident who claimed that on certain autumn nights, when the wind blew from the north, one could hear what sounded like digging coming from the vicinity of the old Whitlow property, as if someone or something is still searching beneath the earth. The graduate student, Daniel Keller, became increasingly fascinated by the Whitlow case during his research. His thesis, entitled Psychological Displacement in Appalachian Folklore, the Transmission of Trauma Through Regional Narrative, dedicated an entire chapter to the lingering impact of the Whitlow disappearance on local storytelling. Keller argued that the case represented a form of collective trauma for the Ashe County community, manifesting in recurring narrative motifs involving what lies beneath and speaking what should not be spoken. Keller conducted interviews with several elderly residents who claimed to remember the events of 1891, though most would have been very young at the time. One woman, identified only as Mrs. Ellen Keller's notes, claimed her grandfather had been part of the search party organized by Sheriff McCoy. According to family lore, her grandfather had entered the cellar during the investigation and emerged white as a sheet, refusing to discuss what he had seen. For the remaining 30 years of his life, she claimed, he would not enter any underground space, not even a root cellar, and would grow agitated at the sound of digging. Another elderly resident told Keller that as a child in the early 1900s, he and other local children would dare each other to approach the ruins of the Whitlow house after dark. He recalled one summer evening when he and two friends had crept close enough to see the exposed stone foundation in the moonlight. "We all heard it clear as day," he told Keller. "A man's voice, coming up from where the cellar had been, calling out names one by one, names of people none of us knew. Then it called out Jimmy's name, my friend who was there with us. We ran all the way home, and Jimmy had nightmares for weeks after." The graduate student's thesis was completed but never published. It was archived in the university library, where it gathered dust until 1994, when a fire damaged portions of the collection. The thesis was among the materials lost. In a curious footnote to the case, Keller himself disappeared in 1971 while conducting follow-up research in Ashe County. His abandoned car was found on a forest road approximately 3 miles from the former Whitlow property. Despite an extensive search, no trace of Keller was ever found. The official report concluded he had likely become disoriented while hiking and succumbed to exposure, though his body was never recovered. In 1982, during construction of a new residential development near the site of the former Whitlow farm, workers uncovered what appeared to be a tunnel entrance in a hillside, partially collapsed, but still distinguishable as man-made. The tunnel extended horizontally into the hill for approximately 20 feet before ending in a cave-in. The construction foreman reported that the walls of the tunnel were marked with weird scratches or writing, and that the air inside was unusually cold and had a strange smell, like wet stone and something rotting. The tunnel was deemed a safety hazard and sealed with concrete before any archaeological examination could take place. Today, few residents of Ashe County remember the Whitlow case. The location of the original farmhouse is marked only by the weathered stones of its foundation, now hidden beneath decades of forest growth. Hikers on the nearby trails occasionally report an inexplicable sense of being watched, but such subjective experiences are common in the isolated stretches of the Appalachian wilderness. The property itself has become part of a state nature preserve, with no indication of its troubled history provided on trail maps or information placards. Only a small, easily overlooked plaque placed by the Historical Society in 1997 acknowledges that the Whitlow homestead once stood near this location, without reference to the disappearances or Vernon's murder. Every few years, the case attracts the attention of amateur sleuths or paranormal investigators, drawn by internet forums where fragments of the story circulate. Most leave disappointed, finding nothing but overgrown ruins and the natural sounds of the forest. Occasionally, someone claims to have heard voices or seen mysterious lights near the old foundation after dark, but such reports are dismissed by local authorities as imagination fueled by campfire tales. In 2016, a team from a cable television show focusing on historical mysteries attempted to conduct an archaeological survey of the cellar area using ground-penetrating radar. Their permit was unexpectedly revoked by county officials before work could begin, citing environmental concerns about the impact on the nature preserve. Critics suggested the real motivation was to avoid drawing attention to a dark chapter in local history that might affect tourism. What truly happened at the Whitlow farm in January 1891? The official record provides a straightforward, if incomplete, explanation. Elias Whitlow, suffering from what modern psychiatrists might diagnose as schizophrenia or dissociative identity disorder, murdered his brother and drove his wife to flee into the winter forest, where she perished. Consumed by guilt, Elias eventually took his own life, yet questions remain. What was written on the parchment Elias claimed to have found? What was the origin of the structure beneath the Whitlow cellar? And why were the official records initially suppressed? The most rational explanation is that Elias, perhaps predisposed to mental illness and isolated in the remote farmhouse, experienced a psychotic break that manifested in delusions about something ancient and malevolent beneath his property. His disturbed mind created an elaborate fantasy that eventually drove him to violence against his own family. The subsequent embellishments and local legends represent the natural human tendency to create narrative around tragedy, particularly in isolated communities where oral tradition plays a significant role in cultural transmission. Yet rational explanations sometimes fail to account for the persistence of certain details across independent accounts. The carved symbols that appeared in both the cellar and the cave where Martha's remains were found. The reports of unusual cold and unexplained sounds emanating from the cellar. The consistent descriptions of Elias's changing voice and periods of lost awareness. The archaeological team's discovery of an unusual foundation predating American settlement. Perhaps some secrets are best left buried in the dark soil of Ashe County, beneath the roots of ancient trees that have witnessed countless human tragedies play out against the backdrop of the eternal mountains. The Whitlow case may be closed in official records, but in the whispered stories passed down through generations, it lives on, a warning about the dangers of disturbing what lies beneath the surface, both literally and within the human mind. As you drive through Ashe County today, you might pass the unmarked turn that once led to the Whitlow farm without ever knowing its significance. The mountains keep their secrets well. But sometimes, locals say, if you find yourself on that lonely stretch of road as twilight fades to darkness, you might feel an inexplicable urge to keep driving rather than stop, as if something still waits in those woods, watching for anyone who might be willing to dig just a little deeper than they should. A final curious postscript to the Whitlow case emerged in 2018 when an antique dealer in Richmond, Virginia, purchased the contents of a storage unit whose rent had gone unpaid for decades. Among the items was a small wooden box containing a single item, a stone approximately the size of a man's thumb, possibly quartz, inscribed with markings that matched no known alphabet. Attached was a yellowed label reading only, "Found clenched in his hand. New Orleans, 1891. The stone's current whereabouts are unknown, the dealer having sold it to a private collector whose identity remains confidential. And so the story of the Whitlow family fades into history, preserved only in fragments of documents, local legends, and the silent stones of a forgotten foundation in the Appalachian forest. What truly happened in that cellar during the winter of 1891 may never be known with certainty. Perhaps that uncertainty is for the best. Some things once spoken cannot be unspoken. Some doors once opened cannot be closed. Some secrets belong to the dark earth and should remain buried there, silent and still, beneath the ancient mountains of Ashe County.